We are honored to have here with us today Professor Kevin Crowston from the School of Information Studies, Syracuse University, New York. Professor Crowston will deliver the opening keynote of the 11th CHESS conference for the study of innovation and learning technologies that will be held tomorrow, Tuesday, February 16, 2016, and Wednesday, February 17, at the Open University of Israel campus in Ra'anana. CHESS conference is the major annual event of Israeli researchers of innovation and learning technologies, and it draws more than 500 participants, both academics and practitioners. On behalf of the Research Center for Innovation and Learning Technologies, I would like to thank Professor Crowston for agreeing to conduct this pre-conference seminar. Kevin Crowston is a distinguished professor of information science at the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. He received his PhD in information technologies from the Sloan School of Management, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. His research examines new ways of organizing that are made possible by the extensive use of information and communication technology. His specific research interests include the development of practices of free, liberal, open source software teams, and work practices as well as technology support for citizen science research. Both projects are conducted with the support of the National Science Foundation. He is currently a co-editor-in-chief for the journal Information, Technology, and People. And I'm very glad to invite Professor Crowston to deliver the seminar titled Wikipedia Editor Motivations. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. So thank you very much for that kind introduction, and also for inviting me to come to Israel for the conference and for this seminar. It's been a great pleasure so far, and a great honor to have been invited, so thank you again. As you can see, I changed the title a little bit from what I originally sent. And I'm going to talk for the seminar today about a project that a student and I, Isabel Fenyo and I, have been working on for quite a long time now to try to come up with a model of motivations for user-generated content. And in particular, we've been looking at Wikipedia. The theorizing we started doing a number of years ago, and what I'm going to present today is an attempt to actually do an empirical test of that theory. Since this is a very small group, I hope that you will feel free to ask questions or interrupt as we go along. I'm hoping that after many years of working on this paper, we will finally have something that we can publish. And so, in a sense, this is the dress rehearsal. So if you could share your ideas about how to improve it, that would be greatly appreciated. But first, where did it go? Okay, there it is. All right, so I think in this audience I don't have to spend a lot of time introducing the context. We're interested in user-generated content, and in particular the way that this content can be generated in these online communities. For us, we define this as large numbers of distributed contributors. Can measure it with the popularity, but ranging from dozens to tens of thousands or even more. These contributors are making contributions, mostly unpaid. There's a lot of speculation about why people would do this. There's not a lot of data. And it's jointly focused so that they are collectively innovating this content. And you can actually see many, many, many examples of this on the internet. The example I'm going to draw on is Wikipedia, a very large online encyclopedia. The English one has literally millions of contributors, hundreds of thousands of articles. There are, of course, Wikipedias in many other languages, Hebrew, of course, being one. But you can also see it, for example, with software development in the case of open source. Flickr, in a sense, is a kind of user-generated content. Very popular one is reviews of movies, books, restaurants, hotels, and so on. So we have many, many of these communities that are generating the content. And as I said, so open source is an example where the code is built up, and you can see that the contributions come from many different people. Open source is the example I'm going to talk, sorry, Wikipedia is the example I'm going to talk about with all the different edits that people have contributed, as well as the discussion that goes into contributions. Motivation was one of the first things that people looked at in these contexts. So why do people do it? Many of the early models were proposed by economists, because economists were very, very puzzled by this phenomena of people contributing without getting paid. If you're an economist, that doesn't make very much sense. So a very simple economic model simply says the benefit has to exceed the cost. The costs are usually fairly minor. Opportunity cost of the time, something else you could be doing. And the benefits that were identified, at least in the case of open source, free Libre open source software, were things like future job offers, that you were basically doing a demonstration of your skill to potential employers. Others pointed at things like ego gratification from the peer recognition, but these were taken together as basically some kind of signaling. Another hypothesis was that the payoff was simply the working code, that people were contributing because they wanted a program that did some particular function, and so by adding to it, they were getting the code. So this is basically this model, this performance expectancy model. So you put in a certain amount of effort, which is the cost, you get a performance, and if the outcomes are more valuable than the cost, then you'll do it. The problem is that when you think about other kinds of output, you end up with a somewhat richer picture. And in particular, this is from a survey that was done by, did I put the names? Yeah, so I forgot to put the names of the authors on here, but they did a survey of people contributing to open source, and it turns out it doesn't quite match up with the hypothesized economic model. In particular, you see some factors that are related, like, for example, self-marketing, but that turns out only to be important for a subset of developers who are being paid for what they're creating. Instead, you see things like human capital development, so basically learning new skills by practicing them in the context of open source. And a very interesting one is a very high set of scores here for self-determination, meaning that people like working on open source because it gives them a chance to pick their own tasks. And if you're a programmer who works as a programmer for a living, you spend most of your time doing things that other people think are important. And so one of the reasons people like open source is because it gives them a chance to do what they think is important themselves. And things like personal need for the system that was hypothesized as one of the output is actually fairly low. Interestingly, community identification is actually fairly low. Sorry, selling products is actually fairly low for most of the developers. So in fact, there's not that sort of monetary output. The thing is that when you start looking at other kinds of outputs, like Wikipedia in particular, the motivations don't quite overlap. So some of them do, self-determination, altruism, peer recognition, but future rewards basically doesn't seem to really work for Wikipedia. It's unlikely you'll get a job as a writer based on your performance in editing Wikipedia. Development of personal skills. Again, the kinds of skills that you develop in Wikipedia don't seem to be the ones that people want to practice in the way that you want to practice programming. And there's this sort of interesting thing around personal needs, which is important for software, that you want a particular piece of software that does something. But generally speaking, anybody who has the knowledge to contribute to a Wikipedia article doesn't actually need the article, because they already have the knowledge. And similarly with a lot of the other things we looked at. So for example, restaurant reviews, it's not clear that you need the review that you're contributing. So instead there's some kind of, some other reason that people are getting involved in doing these things, aside from wanting the output that they're creating themselves. As well, many of these earlier models seem a little bit impoverished because they assume that there's one set of motivations that applies to everybody. So one of the things that we realized is that if you look, again, for example, at open source, there are different roles that people take on in the projects. A common model that's offered is this onion model, concentric layers, where in the center you have the core developers who maybe are spending many hours a week contributing, who have a certain recognition of the other developers who they interact with more frequently. Surrounding that, people who occasionally submit a bug patch or maybe do a little bit of code development but are not part of the core because they're only contributing at a lower level. Active users who maybe only are submitting bug reports, who aren't actually involved in writing the code. And then the vast majority of us who use open source but don't actually contribute directly, sort of passive users. And so it seems reasonable to assume that people in these different roles are going to have different sets of motivations. It's not just the case that someone in the core is more motivated and someone in one of the other roles is less motivated. So we came to the realization that you should probably think about the motivations for those kinds of roles separately. And as well, as I said, a lot of the theorizing was based on these more economic models, and it seemed like there was a different set of literature you could draw on. So what that led us to was a stage model of motivation, or stage theory. In a stage theory, the assumption is that people go through different stages, and the motivations at the different stages are going to be different, and only a few people will advance from one stage to the other. So the most famous example, perhaps, of a stage theory is the theory about how groups form, storming, forming, norming, and conforming. And so the idea there is that teams who are at different points will operate differently. It's not just the case that a brand new team has less of something that a more established team has. The team changes over time. And so that was our idea here, is that we'd look at how people go through different stages of participation. So there's a nice article describing how stage theories work that lays out 4 requirements. One is some kind of a classification system to define the stages, an ordering of the stages, and then, and this is the bulk of what our model is about, is identifying common barriers to people in a particular stage and different barriers for people who are in different stages. So the 3 levels of contribution we identified, we labeled as initial, sustained, and meta. And I'll describe what those mean in a little bit more detail. But initial basically is the first contribution, getting someone to take the step to move from being a Wikipedia reader to someone who actually edits, being someone who uses open source software to someone who actually contributes to the project in some way, someone who reads restaurant reviews to someone who actually contributes their first review. And that initial stage is actually quite a big hurdle when you consider the numbers. Most people here, in fact, actually, how many people here read Wikipedia articles at all? Okay, how many people have actually edited a Wikipedia article? So in this group, it's a slightly higher percentage. Similarly with open source, how many use open source? How many people have contributed a line of code to an open source project or a bug report or anything like that? So again, those sorts of imbalances. The second stage then is the sustained contributors, people who do it regularly. And then what we identified was this third stage of meta contribution, which I'll explain when I get to that point. Instead of drawing on an economic model, what we drew on was a view of contributing as helping. So thinking of this as a helping behavior. So volunteering is, again, not motivated strictly by economic concerns, but instead by this idea that people want to help. And there's a famous theory from Schwartz and Howard about 4 stages in people deciding that they're going to help. That basically lays out the need to recognize that there's a need for help, some kind of feeling that you have an obligation and an ability to help. There's still an evaluation of the cost-benefit, so what would be the cost of volunteering or not. And in the case of helping behaviors, this was originally defined to describe why someone might, for example, if they see someone being mugged in the street, why they might go to help the person who's being assaulted. And so that was intended for these sort of, very quick decisions that that someone might say, do I have a reason why I shouldn't do it? Like maybe I'll get hurt. Since we were looking at cases where people sort of decided over time and in particular decided to help, we did not consider this last one, but we do look at these 3. So if you put those together, in the initial stage, where someone is deciding that they're going to do it, then this recognition of the need seems important, that the project is actually visible enough to attract attention. So for example, people have heard of Wikipedia or they know about these restaurant review sites or what have you. The person is actually curious about it, and this cost benefit then is around the time and benefit to contributing. And that would result then in this initial contribution. Someone moves from being a passive user to an active user. And so again, if you have those four pieces, right, the attention to the need, perceived capacity, cost of contribution, and benefit, you know, the fact that the project exists and someone knows they can contribute seems like it addresses the first. And we included some things that we actually aren't able to test because they're at the project level. So how easy is it to contribute to the project? So one of the things you could argue, for example, that makes Wikipedia so successful is that it's really easy. All you have to do is click on the edit button and you can be an editor. Whereas with open source, the barrier is perhaps a little bit higher, which is maybe why we see that imbalance in this room. So few people do it because you need to know how to program, you have to understand the code, you have to be able to write code at a certain level, and so the barrier there is a bit higher. For most of these domains, there's a certain amount of domain knowledge that's needed, so you actually know something about the topic. Maybe you know how to use your computer, or you know how to use the system. And then in terms of cost, most of the costs are actually fairly low because it is basically just opportunity cost. For the initial contributors, though, one of the things that took a while to figure out was what is the possible benefit for someone to make that step from being just a passive user to having made some kind of contribution. And the thing that was emphasized in a number of the sort of anecdotal writing about this was just curiosity. I wanted to see if you could do it. I wanted to see what would happen, you know, if I edited Wikipedia or what have you. So many of the other motivations that are identified, like obligation to the project or feeling like part of the community, don't really seem like they would work very well for someone who's just making that very, very first contribution. Because if it's the first contribution, then, you know, you're not really part of the community. It's hard to see how you might feel obligated to it. So we thought it was mostly just in terms of curiosity. Yes?
When you talk about benefits or motivations for contributing, I would ask, I think there is a strong element of defending or promoting ideas.
Yes.
Defending my own
right.
theory against
right.
opponents.
So I think I agree with that, but it seems like that's much more likely to be at the next stage of contribution, which is the sustained contribution. So for sustained contributors, you know, the person's made a contribution, they've gotten some kind of feedback. Perhaps if it's a more substantive comment or a contribution, they've gotten better feedback. If you go into Wikipedia and you just, you know, fix a typo or something like that, then probably you won't get any feedback at all. If you make a good contribution to the article in the right way, or if you submit a good bug patch to an open source project or something like that, or a good restaurant review, then you might get good feedback that encourages you to do it more. And so a few people then become sustained contributors where the work becomes its own reward. And in part, I think it's exactly what you said, that, that you feel like you have something to contribute. You start to identify with the community. You start to feel like there's some obligation to do this. In many of these settings, there's a sense of sort of generalized reciprocity, that I contribute restaurant reviews because I find them useful. And so I'm contributing to the community by doing this part of the work. So again, some of these things will probably still be there, your perceived capacity to contribute, the visibility, but it won't be just about the visibility of the project itself, that there'll be these specific needs that you see that you think you can feel. It seems like identification with the project's ideology is going to be important. There are probably some personal factors that we can't really measure, like altruism. That was certainly one that was mentioned in terms of open source. That you expect you're going to get some value out of the project. And then the work itself has have certain characteristics. And in this part, we were drawing on Hackman and Oldman's model of work design that suggested that, getting good feedback, autonomy, feeling like you have a choice of what you can work on, and that it's actually using various kinds of skills that you have will make the work itself rewarding. And then in the third stage, we identified in a lot of projects a role which has not been written about too much, which is meta-contribution. So the idea there is that you move from just being a regular contributor to being someone who somehow helps to organize the project. So in open source, a number of the open source projects have foundations, and so people might become a member of the foundation and help govern the project. In Wikipedia, you see a large range of roles like maintainer, admin, sysop, bureaucrats, stewards, who, instead of writing the Wikipedia articles, do things like dispute resolution, helping to organize or oversee wiki projects where there are a number of different articles that are being written, helping to organize, for example, the local Wikipedia foundation users group. So in many countries, many cities, there's sort of a users group of Wikipedia editors who will get together, so helping to organize those things. And so what that means is that rather than helping the project to grow by writing the next article or writing the next line of code, you are helping the community to grow by making it a better place for people to contribute, a better place for people to work. And so there's this interesting shift in the way people start to think about it. So for most people, Wikipedia is a collection of articles. For the meta-contributors, Wikipedia is a collection of editors. And the goal is not to have a better encyclopedia, but to have a better encyclopedia writing community. And so their contribution is as much, not necessarily writing the next sentence, but helping to make sure that editors are productive and feel welcome, and that things that would prevent them from doing a good job of writing get cleared up. Maybe it's why people become department chairs in the good sense, is that you start to think about the department as a collection of people that you want to help, as opposed to a collection of courses. And this seems to be based on some individual characteristics, like being someone who likes helping, but very much on group identification, that if you feel like it's an important group that you're a part of, that has goals that you support, then perhaps you want to contribute in this way. And this then enables more basic contributions, so that it makes it easier for people to contribute more. At any rate, so based on this thinking, we ended up with a very, very large number of things that we might look at. For the meta-contributors in particular, it seems like some of the literature from social movements would be useful, thinking about the different motives that people have for joining a social movement, so Wikipedia more as a social movement. And again, this lines up pretty much exactly with the helping model in this sense, the personal gains and the positive evaluation of the goals, but then also social reinforcement from other members and the positive feelings from being part of the group. So it seemed like those were the kinds of things that would be motivating at that level. So you can see that as you go from the initial contribution to the sustained contribution to the meta-contribution, the kinds of motivations that are important seem likely to shift. That an initial one might just be, can I do it? Do I have something to say? To, is this kind of an interesting sort of work to do? Is this a way to promote the kinds of positions that I think are important? To, is this a community that I'm part of, and a community that I want to see succeed and that I can contribute to? And so we have a picture like this with the same kinds of things, that instead of being domain knowledge for the meta-contributors, it's going to be community knowledge. So knowing who the people are and how they're related to each other, feelings of accountability to the community or trust in the community, feeling that you belong to the group, are going to be the kinds of things that are going to drive this sort of meta-contribution. So if you put it all together, actually, I should probably say the next slide and then come back to this one. we had this sort of very long laundry list of hypotheses we had about what might be motivating. In order to test this, we tried to find whatever data we could, and it turns out that the Wikimedia Foundation, the people who run Wikipedia, actually have done surveys of the editors, and the one in 2011 included a number of questions about why people do it. So they had this sort of laundry list of reasons why people started editing and why they continue editing. This actually was a rather nice data set because they had about 5,000 respondents. So it gave us a good mass of data with which to test the theory. The problem was that it had this predefined set of questions that they were asking. And so what that meant was we couldn't necessarily create the questions to test each one of the items. We instead had to sort of hunt around to find ones that they had asked. The other problem, of course, is that since it's focused just on Wikipedia, it doesn't have any comparative data about, Wikipedia versus something else. So some of the questions that were at the project level aren't ones that we can test. But it did have a bunch of items that seemed fairly useful. What we did with this one was to define initial contributors as people who had only made fewer than 5 edits. 5 is a number which the Wikimedia Foundation uses as sort of an informal cutoff in terms of levels of activity. 5 was enough so that someone who was just trying it out, had done a few things to see whether or not they were interested. They might have done more than one, but they wouldn't have done a lot. So fewer than 5 edits we defined as the initial contributors. Sustained were then those who had made more than 5 edits. And the range in the data set was from 0. There were a few people who had done 0 up to 60,000 or so. So some people who were very, very, very motivated. And then for meta contributors, we took everyone who had a user access level higher than just being a regular user. So that's all of the special titles in Wikipedia. So sysop, bureaucrat, so on and so forth. I should say that the editor survey was actually done fairly carefully. One of the concerns about doing surveys in an online setting is that if somebody sees the survey more often, that you might get a higher response rate from just having logged in more often. So one of the things they did, for example, was they only showed you the request to do the survey once. So they were trying to control for some of those things. Having said that, this definitely oversamples people who are a little bit more involved. If you have only come to Wikipedia for the first time, then chances are you'll say, fill out a survey, why would I do that? So filling out surveys is also a kind of helping behavior, right? So in a sense, this oversamples for people who are higher on being willing to help. But it does actually have a pretty good cross-section, even if it does overrepresent certain groups. So when we looked through this, we developed a set of hypotheses based on the factors I mentioned, so perceived need for contributions. And you can actually see that there was a number of questions that were asked on the survey that seemed related to that. Like, I saw an error and I wanted to fix it. I saw a red link, which is to say a link to an article that didn't exist. Finding mistakes, finding articles that are incomplete. Yeah?
I just wanted to break you before the data. Can you please specify a bit more about the population of auditors? Only Americans or all over?
There were more Americans than other groups, but I think that's because there are more American editors than other groups. But they had respondents from literally all over the world. In terms of the languages spoken, for example, or the Wikipedia version that was edited, I think there were several dozen languages represented. So, having said that, it does definitely have the same skew that the Wikipedia itself has. So more Americans than other groups. Domain expertise was, I like to contribute to subject matters in which I have expertise. There are actually a couple others which were added. Agreement with project philosophy seemed important. So I believe information should be freely available. I like Wikipedia's philosophy of openness and collaboration. Identification with the project. I wanted to gain a reputation. All of my friends do it. Actually, we had that one as well. One of them was interesting, this curiosity motive. I wanted to see whether anyone else could edit. One of the things the survey didn't have was these expected benefits. So we don't have data about those, unfortunately. Opportunities to learn, though. I wanted to learn new skills. That was the question they asked. Just fun as a motive. It's fun. And then we had a number of things about positive feedback. So various things that could have happened with interaction with others. Like others compliment you, things get selected as featured articles, and so on. A number of different kinds of positive feedback. And interestingly, also negative feedback. Editors pushing their point of view, being looked down on, having edits reverted, having an article deleted. And negative feedback wasn't what we were initially thinking to find. But since it's there, we decided to include it, and we assumed that these would be negative things. So these kinds of positive feedback would encourage you to do more. These kinds of negative feedback would encourage you to do less. So if I go back now, what we started off by doing was comparing sustained and initial contributors. And we assumed that if you saw more of a need for contributions, you were more likely to be sustained. That in terms of domain expertise, we thought it would be equal, because in order to make the initial contribution, you have to feel like you know something. If you're going to go edit an article, and we thought that would continue through. But these things about agreement with the project philosophy and identification, we had hypothesized that those would not be the initial motivations. That, if you have never edited Wikipedia before, it's hard to say, oh, I belong to the Wikipedia community. So we thought those would be stronger for the sustained contributors. Curiosity, we thought, would be just with the initial, that that's a reason to make the first contribution. But the problem with curiosity is that once you satisfy it, it's gone. And so it's hard to say that someone would continue editing because of curiosity. That's why they would do it the first time and not go on. And actually, that's part of why we think there's this big skew between people who've edited once, of which there are millions, and people who edit continuously, of which there are tens of thousands. It's part because lots of people try it once out of curiosity and then stop. As I said, we hypothesized this to be bigger, but we don't have data. Opportunities to learn, we thought would be higher for the sustained. Fun, we thought would be higher for sustained. And as I said, positive feedback we thought would be related to doing more editing, and negative with less. And then turning to the meta versus sustained, because the meta contributors are shifting from writing individual articles to helping with the community, we thought that to the extent that they thought there was a need for contributions, they wouldn't be doing that. So that would be less for the meta contributors. Domain expertise would be less important because the contribution they're making is not tied to individual articles anymore. It's tied to trying to develop the community. We thought that these people would be equally motivated by the project philosophy and the identification. Again, curiosity is only at the initial stage, so it should be the same between those two. And we thought that these would stay the same in the sense that they would be important to be making a sustained contribution, but they would be equally important to being a meta contributor. So you wouldn't see a difference in those, between meta and sustained. So it ends up with a slightly complicated picture because we're sort of hypothesizing that these different things will have different effects at different levels and in different directions. But again, that's part of the point about proposing this as a stage model. It's not just the case that as you go up in the amount of contributions you do, these things get stronger and stronger and stronger. Some of them only have an impact at one stage. Some of them, sort of plateau and stop being effective. So that's part of the point about the stage contributions. Part of the point about the stage model is that it allows you to say, here's a variable, but it only has an impact up to a certain point, and then it stops. All right. So what did we do in terms of the analysis? What we did was a zero inflated negative binomial regression. Actually, before I dive into this, maybe I should stop and see if there are questions about the hypotheses. or comments about the hypotheses, whether this is what other people would have hypothesized or whether we're just...
Maybe not the negative feedback, because sometimes, well, if you get negative feedback, then, well, you may want to place your point. I mean, there are some pages on Wikipedia that people argue and they edit and re-edit and try to stress their points. So negative feedback could be many things.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that this maybe shouldn't be something that reduces input, that negative feedback might actually cause you to do more.
Yes, I'm saying that if like you're trying to look at it, you know, like combining two questions or even more questions if they and trying to measure the reliability, then maybe you will not find it because some people are motivated to contribute and stress their point even if they receive negative feedback.
Oh, so okay, so that's right. Actually, so it's an interesting point. So negative feedback could be discouraging and cause you to drop out. It could be that it has no effect, you just ignore it and go on. It could be that you say, no, they're wrong, and I'm going to show them. Okay, we assumed that it would always be the first, that it would just be discouraging, but it's interesting to hear that you think it might be.
I was trying to ask how much, what is the role of my need to defend my positions, my academic theories, or
right? Okay.
The use of political trying to giving disrespect to other ideas, about Holocaust, for example.
Right.
And try to edit those in order to create a different opinion on something.
Okay. Actually, the last thing you said reminded me of something that we didn't include, but it's the need to present a point of view, because one of the things about Wikipedia is the philosophy of neutral point of view. So it is this interesting question whether wanting to present a point of view works in the Wikipedia context, but it seems like it could be motivating, so maybe we need to think about how that would fit in. Again, that is probably something that would separate a sustained contributor, having some kind of perspective that they think is important to be included in the Wikipedia.
In the Israeli context, because it encourages lots of response. When we get negative feedback, it encourages lots of people to present the local point of view.
Right. Yeah. Other questions or comments? What
about other barriers like language, culture? Most of the respondents were from America.
Yeah, so most were editing their own native language Wikipedia. So it's a good question. We don't, unfortunately, I don't believe the survey asked specifically about people's difficulties with the language. I think there was an assumption that if, for example, you were more fluent in Hebrew, then you would probably be editing the Hebrew version of the Wikipedia as opposed to the English version.
I will focus only on the Hebrew Wikipedia, whether it's not necessarily the right way to do it. I may look into the English one.
Right.
And then we would like to share some of the articles.
Yeah.
Or translate them, or interact.
Right.
Do whatever.
Yeah.
Technology probably it's not the barrier because it's fairly easy, but the culture of things might be an issue, language might be an issue.
Okay. So that is actually one thing, is that we mostly discounted costs on the assumption that the cost of editing Wikipedia was just the opportunity cost of the time, which was more or less equal for everybody. But hearing you say that makes me wonder whether we should go back and look at things to put back in on the cost side of the equation. Because you'll notice that I have, perceived need, perceived ability, and then basically benefits with, as I said, the assumption that the costs would more or less equalize, but maybe there's a way of...
I'm comparing that to the level of activity within a form, for example.
Right.
So over there you're also kind of generating valuable information,
Mm-hmm.
knowledge. So what is your motivation to contribute over there versus here? If there is any barrier, different barrier here and there, I don't know. Kind of
Right,
raising questions
right.
more than providing answers to that. But my curiosity was to see if there is any, similarity.
Right.
Between
Maybe, yeah, I should take another look at the questions. There may be some questions that address that sort of... We definitely did in the overall theorizing think that the perceived ease of contributing to the project was quite important. The thing is that in the context of Wikipedia, we weren't sure if we could distinguish different people in terms of how easy it was for them to contribute. But maybe looking at the language and culture issues would be something that we could do. Yeah.
Regarding perceived need for contributions, I'm not sure about the meta versus sustain, because if I believe contributions are important, and by becoming meta, I can facilitate many more contributions, then it's not necessarily a negative impact. I could still move from sustain to meta,
Right.
and believe that contributions are important. But again,
But that your role is to do them in a different way.
yes.
Okay.
And regarding the neutral point of view, still, if you believe it's not neutral, you want to bring your own point of view and balance the
Right.
imbalance
Right.
out there. So that's clearly a motivator.
Okay. So again, this negative one may be not quite as negative as, right. Yeah, so the cost was definitely an issue that we struggled with a little bit, because in the original theory, there's a balancing of the benefits and the costs. And as I said, we sort of tried a couple of different things we thought would be there in terms of costs, like how much time you have, except it's hard to know. Another one that we were thinking of in terms of ability was whether something about ability with computers was important. But again, it seems like, for Wikipedia, you don't really have to be that expert in computers to do something. So that's probably more important in the context of like open source. But for the Wikipedia, maybe not so much. Okay. All right, so let me go on. As I said, so we had this data from the Wikipedia Foundation, this survey they did. So the first one we did, we were trying to look at the initial versus sustained contributors. We used what's called a zero-inflated negative binomial regression. Negative binomial basically is the kind of regression you use to predict counts. Because it doesn't assume a normal distribution. It assumes a skewed distribution, which is what counts tend to look like. And then the zero inflated part is it actually does two regressions. One is to predict whether or not you're a zero or not. And then the second is to predict if you aren't a zero, how many things you will have contributed. So it sort of does the two parts. So basically, a logistic regression to predict whether the contributor is initial or not initial. And then this negative binomial to say, if you're not an initial contributor, how many contributions will you make as a sustained contributor? And then to test the sustained versus meta, we don't actually have a count of meta contributions. So we just did the logistic regression part. So is someone a sustained contributor versus are they a meta contributor? And we basically had all of the above variables as predictors. We estimated them with stata. So here is the results of the sustained versus initial. So again, this is a logistic, I think it was. Yes, a logistic regression. So all of the things in green increase the likelihood that you're a sustained contributor, and all the things in red increase the likelihood or decrease the likelihood that you're sustained. And I sort of grouped them by the hypotheses. So you'll see, for example, that I continue because I'm looking for mistakes. If you agreed with that statement, then you were about 3 times more likely to be a sustained contributor. Or if you saw incomplete articles, you're about 50% more likely. You'll notice the other 2 aren't significant, but they're in the hypothesized direction. So H1, sort of mixed support for that one. H2, if you say that you continue because you have expertise, you're more likely. Interestingly, the other ones are, one of them, demonstrating knowledge, is actually negative, but not significant. H3, which is about agreement with Wikipedia's philosophy, not significant. And in fact, if anything, in the opposite direction from what's hypothesized. H4, my friends contribute, or I want to gain reputation, not significant. H5, see whether anyone could edit. So in other words, satisfying curiosity, significantly negative. You're only about 2/3 as likely to continue if that's why you started. Interestingly, start because you wanted to learn new skills, negative prediction of continuing. But fun is positive. Positive feedback is positive, and extremely positive. It's like 35 times more likely to continue. And negative feedback, surprisingly, is also positive. About 5 times more likely to say that 5 times more likely to be a sustained contributor if you report getting negative feedback. We also had a bunch of other things that were in the regression that we didn't really hypothesize about initially, but some of them are kind of interesting. So female is a little bit alarming. 50% less likely to be a sustained contributor if you report being female.
Similar finding is reported in Israel. There was a PhD work with somebody in the Weizmann Institute. She also found that females are less contributing.
Yes. Right. So much less likely to report being a sustained contributor. About half as likely to report being a sustained contributor if you're female. This one I thought was interesting. If you're assigned to edit, sometimes people do that in a classroom setting. They'll assign the students to edit a Wikipedia article. Again, that makes you much less likely to continue. And again, I think what that points to is the difficulty of these external motivations for doing Wikipedia. That an external motivation like being assigned doesn't seem very effective. All right, so that was the first one. The negative binomial part predicts how much you will contribute based on these things. So for the ones with H1, it's actually sort of this mixed bag. Some of them increase how much you contribute, some of them decrease, which seemed a little bit strange. Saying that you knew a lot or you have expertise actually was associated with a reduced amount of contribution. Saying that you thought the philosophy was important or that information should be free, again, reduced, was associated with fewer contributions. Friends contributing, though, was associated with more contributions. Curiosity, as we hypothesized, has basically no relationship with the amount of contributions, but neither does learning new skills. And fun, positive feedback, and negative feedback are both associated with more contributions. And in terms of some of these other variables, so again, professional reasons, being assigned to edit, wanting to be in a discussion, those were all associated with fewer contributions. Female was being also associated with fewer contributions. And age, interestingly, slightly more. So for each year, a slightly larger number of contributions. Okay, so those are all the initial versus the sustained. Turning to the meta versus sustained. So interestingly, most of the things about seeing a need for edits was associated with a reduced chance of being a meta contributor. So to the extent that you said that you thought that Wikipedia needed, an error fixed or mistakes corrected or incomplete articles added to, you're less likely to have one of these meta roles. Similarly with reporting expertise, so to the extent that you reported you had some expertise about some topic, you were less likely to be a meta editor. On the other hand, agreeing with the philosophy, was associated with a higher likelihood that you'd be a meta-editor. And gaining reputation was associated with a higher likelihood that you'd be a meta-contributor. Curiosity didn't have any impact. Learning new skills actually had a negative impact. If you reported that as a motive for starting, you were less likely to become a meta-contributor. And fun, positive feedback, negative feedback, again, were both associated with more likelihood of being a meta-contributor. In this case, age actually was negative, so older people were slightly less likely, but female did not have an impact for the meta. So summarizing these, this is what we initially hypothesized and what we found. So we had hypothesized that a higher perceived need with contributions would make you more likely to be sustained, which it does. It has sort of mixed findings, though, in terms of how much you do. Domain expertise, we thought, would be equal. Actually, that's not right, is it? I had it the other way. At any rate, it turns out that domain expertise is slightly associated with being, with contributing less, which is odd. Agreement with project philosophy we thought would be higher for sustained contributors, but in fact it's not. The place it's higher is actually for meta-contributors. And similarly with identification for the project, we thought it would be higher for sustained. It's slightly mixed for sustained, but it is higher for meta-contributors. Curiosity was the way we thought. Basically, curiosity is associated with less likelihood of being an initial sustained contributor. And then a couple that worked out more or less how we thought, fun and positive feedback. A little bit strange in that we thought they would be equal for the meta-contributors, but in fact they are also important. And then negative feedback, Lisa was right. We thought that that would discourage people. It turns out that, if anything, that's associated with more likelihood to be a sustained contributor, more likelihood to be a meta-contributor, and a positive association with the number of edits you do. So, summing it up, in terms of this first set of motivations around seeing a need, it does seem to be the case that if you see a need for edits, you're more likely to become a sustained contributor, and you're likely to stay a sustained contributor as opposed to becoming a meta-contributor. The domain expertise, I have no idea what's going on with that, because you would think that having domain expertise, feeling like you have something to contribute would cause you to contribute more, but it's actually negative for both of those. These ones here about the project philosophy I thought were really, really interesting, because there's this assumption that people are editing Wikipedia because they agree with the philosophy, but it appears that, in fact, that really is why people become meta-contributors. That people take this step to try to support the community as a community because they agree with the philosophy, or they come to agree with the philosophy because they've taken on those roles, and that it's less important for the regular day-to-day editing than we assumed. And that seems unexpected. So that finding, I think, is worth trying to follow up on a little bit more. But then in terms of the benefits, curiosity definitely worked the way we thought. If you are curious about it and you satisfy your curiosity, then you're done. It's a little surprising. Opportunities to learn don't seem to be having an impact, but maybe that's part of the Wikipedia reality, is that it doesn't really give people a chance to practice these new skills in the way that open source does. So in open source, you learn about a domain, you learn about programming. Maybe with Wikipedia, where it's more about writing, people don't feel like they're learning new skills in quite the same way. Fun, maybe we shouldn't have been surprised by, but fun turns out to be important for the meta-contributors as well. So maybe that makes sense that you wouldn't get involved if you weren't a meta-contributor. Positive feedback similarly. And negative feedback, we were very surprised by, but it seems like other people are not quite so surprised by that. So maybe we should have expected that as well. All right, questions about that before I go on?
Again, I don't believe in altruism, and I think there is agenda. The word agenda I miss here among the criteria. I think even when you put a neutral, completely neutral article about the country, there is a hidden agenda in the way you describe Australia as a country who killed so many Aboriginal people, or as a beautiful country to be a tourist in. And these are, and I think one of the major elements that push people for presenting articles is to promote hidden agendas.
Right.
Not only an article about cumulonimbus clouds. And so I wonder if it's possible to...
Right. So we are limited by the data that the foundation collected. They do have one which kind of speaks to that, which is to popularize a topic, which is not exactly what you said. That's as close as it gets. And you'll notice that that is not significant in any of these regressions. So popularize a topic, to the extent that people agree with that or don't agree with that, it doesn't seem to be related to their contribution. The foundation, I think, maybe for obvious reasons, did not ask, did you join to push an agenda? Maybe they should have. I think there would be a certain amount of demand there, though. I doubt anyone who edits Wikipedia regularly would admit that they're there to push an agenda, even if we might believe that that's...
It's just, it exists.
Yeah, the problem is that it conflicts with the stated Wikipedia rule about neutral point of view. That, but yes, you raise a very good point. A neutral point of view is not neutral because it's zero. It's neutral because it has positive and negatives expressed fairly. And to the extent that an article has only one and is missing the other, then adding the other, which is not a neutral act, advances neutrality. It's actually a very interesting point. It's not something which is very well captured in the kind of surveying that the foundation did. And let's see, in terms of the helping behavior, you would expect that to be something that, well, you know, actually one place where it sort of does fit is in this one, incomplete articles. So incomplete can be incomplete in terms of facts, but it can also be incomplete in terms of point of view. So maybe the fact that it's certainly a predictor of someone being a sustained contributor, that they see incomplete articles. Maybe that's one place where some of the things you're talking about would fit in. Although it's interesting because it does predict that you'd be sustained, but it actually predicts that you will do fewer edits. So maybe that just speaks to the kind of contribution that people are making, that, you know, they're continuing to edit, but they're not making as many edits as other people are. All right, so those were the findings. I think there's some practical implications. Some of these are from the model as a whole. Some of them are from the work we did in particular. So one is simply that project visibility is important. You know, people have to know that you're there. They have to know that you need contributions. And so there's a lot of effort in a lot of these projects to do that. Yeah?
Okay, can I just go back a minute to the general structure of the study? I understand you created a model that was supposed to explain contribution across different types of...
Right. So why someone would be in one stage versus the other, and which motivations would be more effective.
But not necessarily on Wikipedia, but in general. At least the examples that you brought
Yes.
from various contexts.
Yep.
And then you created a questionnaire based on...
No. The foundation did a survey, and we have the data from the survey they did. And so it's a slightly awkward position, which it turns out lots and lots of people find themselves in, which is trying to find in a survey somebody else did questions that speak to the constructs you're interested in.
But you could create those constructs sustain versus meta, for example, on the basis of that more general model, the one that goes beyond Wikipedia.
Yes. Well, in fact, we did.
And then you tested it on the Wikipedia sample.
Yes.
Okay, I think there's a bit of a problem here to me.
Mm-hmm.
On two levels. One is, I was exposed to at least 3 different contexts with the same interesting question, which
right.
is to me a marvelous question. One is, for example, review systems.
Yep.
The ones that you mentioned. The other, the one that you mentioned, was talking about more academic contributions, where you want to collaborate and share knowledge. And the third one was the Wikipedia in Israel. And it seemed to me, that was my personal exposure, and it seemed to me that the rules of the game in these different contexts are so different that it would cause some kind of problem when you come to what you call these constructs and mapping them to the existing questionnaires of Wikipedia. For example, when you come to talk about the meta, it seems to me that it's much more appropriate for the review systems or the open access that you mentioned, where people really go from contributing to specific knowledge to organizing the system so that other people can contribute more effectively. But in the Wikipedia, at least the one that I was exposed here, the same people continue to contribute to specialized areas, but simply undertake additional responsibilities.
Actually, there is a little data about that on the survey, and it does break down. So I think you're right. It's not the case that because someone is doing meta, they stop editing altogether. But it is a distinctive set of reasons why they take on those meta roles. That would be our argument, is that it's not just that you have this population of editors and people who have a lot of motivations to edit also do meta. It's that there are reasons why people edit, and then there's a different set of reasons why someone would choose to take on these meta roles. In fact, that's the main argument that we're trying to make, is that if you think about those 3 stages of an initial contributor, a sustained contributor, a meta contributor, it's not that there's a single dimension called motivation, and the initial is at one end and the meta at the other end. It's that there are 3 separate dimensions. The initial are at a certain point on one of the dimensions. The sustained are distributed across a second set of dimensions, and the meta has a third set of dimensions.
My point is that when you're trying to create these constructs and also explain the underlying dynamics, I think it would be important also to look at the special conditions and motivations and behaviors and the types of stakeholders in the particular context of Wikipedia. So I come back to this example, and you just responded, so I'm not going to repeat it, but in general, I think there's a problem using the word meta in this context of Wikipedia. The other one...
I'm sorry, I guess I don't quite understand, because it's very clear that there are some people who spend time, for example, doing dispute resolution, which is different than contributing the next edit or the next section to an article. So there is this different kind of contribution, right?
Right, but the same, what I'm saying, at least from hearing about the community here, the community of editors in Israel, Wikipedia and Hebrew, they undertake additional responsibilities, but they continue to work heavily in contributing to particular and editing particular items.
Right. So, but the point is that not everybody who edits does dispute resolution, for example. Right. In fact, I didn't give the exact numbers, but in the 5,000 or so people, there were about 500 or so who were initial, and about 4,500 who were sustained, and I think about another 500 or so who were meta. And I think that that's probably about the right orders of magnitude. That I'm sorry, it's probably 10 to 10 to 10 to 1, 10 to 1, or hundreds to 1, 10 to 1. That it's only a subset, a small subset of the people who actually take on these meta roles. And so the question then is, what are the motivations for someone to take on the meta roles as opposed to simply continuing as an editor? And the point you raised is actually very, very well taken, which is that meta contributors don't necessarily stop being regular contributors. But it's, I think, very clear that only a subset of the people who are really sustained contributors actually do any of these other things. Most people simply edit.
I don't want to take up too much time. The point is that I think coming out from the particular context of the Wikipedia or the media, you may have resulted in a different terminology rather than meta. It might be more an issue, at least from this context in Israel, of privileges, of what kind of privileges people have to override other people's.
Yeah. So, well, that is actually in the Wikipedia context a bit of an issue in that we did operationalize meta contribution not in terms of what people do, but in terms of the privileges they have. And part of the issue is finding data, given that we're using someone else's survey, that actually speaks to this question of how much of a meta contribution does someone make. There are a set of questions on the survey that ask about some of the actual behaviors, and we have looked at trying to use that data, and it sounds like what you're saying is that it would be more convincing not just conflating, having an administrator privilege with actually making the kind of meta contributions, though it's sort of at least an indirect measure in the sense that the reason that you have it is because you stood for election and got elected as an admin. But
I agree, and the second aspect that maybe you could benefit from understanding better the particular context rather than trying to create a general model for contribution is at least from here, the importance of this community of editors. They to understand what their impact is.
Right.
Because they, at least here, I see they built such a tight community with a hierarchy and with mutual recognition and respect, that drives, I don't know in terms of percentage, that drives so much of how people behave.
Yeah, but actually the interesting...
One more thing, and leaving the Israeli context, I understand also in the general context of the English Wikipedia that the type of relationships that develop between some of the people and indeed that issue of positive and negative feedback has resulted in some kind of decline in the number of editors.
Yes.
And part of it was explained, at least in a recent article, that people who got the kind of guidance and support at the initial stages, they remained and others didn't. The ones who didn't get it or got negative reviews simply vanished from the pool. The message is this, that understanding better the relationships inside the community might simply add to the richness of your conclusions.
So I think that there's a difference between the things that you would find in observation of a group and the things that come out in the survey. Because in the group, there's probably some amount of selection that the people who are easy to observe are the ones who are, in fact, feeling like it's an important group that they belong to and that they want to contribute to. The thing which is interesting in terms of the survey findings, at least, is that those factors, friends contributing and wanting to develop status in the group, don't in fact predict whether someone is more likely to be a sustained contributor. So So I think that there's certainly a part of the population for which that's true. And in fact, maybe a part of the population that goes on to become meta-contributors in particular are interested in those sorts of reputational issues. And actually, I mean, to be honest, friends was a factor, you know, to the extent that your friends contribute, you're more likely to contribute more. But it doesn't seem like reputation, for example, is what's driving ordinary editing. Or at least that's not something which shows up in the regression. So it could just be, you know, differences in the population that you can observe versus the population that answered the survey. Could be differences in, you know, different language settings. As I said, so some of the practical implications, barriers to entry, I think, are important. One of the explanations actually for the recent decline in edits in Wikipedia is that it's just become that much harder to become an editor. It used to be, you know, the motto of Wikipedia is an encyclopedia that anyone can edit. A recent article said an encyclopedia that anybody who's willing to read all of the rules and then get involved in the discussion and then convince other people that they have a point of view and they have something to contribute and is willing to put up with having their edits rejected 6 times, any of those people can edit. So, so part of what's happened, I think, that drives some of this decline that at least you're seeing in the English language Wikipedia is that you know, enough of the Wikipedia, enough of the encyclopedia has been written that if you want to add something to it, you have to negotiate these bureaucratic barriers and the barriers of the existing editors. So the barrier to entry is definitely something which is going up, at least in the English Wikipedia, and the positive feedback is actually going down. It used to be that, you know, if you're desperate for edits, every edit is valuable, and if you know, if you think like the article's in pretty good shape, then in fact most edits are not encouraged. Most editors' experience, mine included, is that you make a contribution and it gets reverted within a couple of minutes. And so, so that kind of negative feedback may be part of what's driving people away from becoming sustained contributors. And again, this could be language dependent. We did not put language in as a factor. I think it would be interesting to separate out the English language from all the other languages, or maybe do some stratification by size, you know, how big the Wikipedias are. Yeah, so some of these things, actually the articulating shared values I think is an interesting one because it is sort of a general piece of advice about these communities, but I think in fact thinking about where shared values fit in. Is it really something which is driving sustained contribution? Because it doesn't seem to be the case in the Wikipedia. Maybe it's something which is in fact more important for getting people to be meta-contributors. And the possibility of meta-contribution, I think, is an interesting one because it gives people something to aspire to. So if you are a sustained editor, then in fact there are other roles that are available in the system beyond that. And so that is something, you know, just like seeing the levels in a video game, that there's something to aspire to that you can move up. The research implications, one obvious one I think is just to be sure to consider the role of the participants. There's a lot of studies that sort of average everyone together, but the average of an initial contributor and a meta-contributor doesn't make any sense because they're just doing such different things and we would argue have very different motivations for doing it. There is in all of these a very skewed distribution where a very small number of people, the intense sustained contributors, do most of the work. And so it makes sense to focus on them. But because there's such a long tail, even the people who make only 1 or 2 contributions, since there are so many of them, that is actually a fairly substantial proportion of the total. And the point is that what this group needs and what this group needs could be very, very different. And so you may, in fact, end up having a system where you can get some value from people who are only going to do 1 or 2 things, which is a different kind of value than you get from the people who make the bulk of the contributions. And also, I think, separating out the meta contributions and considering them as their own kind of thing. One of the things that's very problematic about trying to analyze Wikipedia data, for example, is that it has edits, how many edits someone's made, but it's very hard to get a handle on how much of the meta contribution they've made. And similarly in other kinds of settings, it's easy to count the regular contributions. It's a lot harder to count these meta contributions. One thing that I would be interested in exploring in future work is how meta contribution is related to leadership. Is that really a kind of leadership role, or is leadership yet another specific kind of meta contribution? How do you conceptualize those separately? So I'm going to skip some of these. I think Dov's point that a lot of this is very much tied to the specific context is exactly right. So this has been a test just in Wikipedia. From what I have seen of open source, it seems like it more or less works for open source. There are lots and lots of other kinds of user-generated content, and understanding the extent to which this model works in those other settings is interesting. So for example, a lot of people have been studying massive multiplayer games like World of Warcraft, or what's the one which is sort of distributed Legos that the kids build? Minecraft. Yes, so Minecraft would actually be a very interesting one. Is there, in fact, a role of meta contribution in Minecraft? Do any of these factors explain why some people might do a lot of building in Minecraft versus relatively little? A very important societal question, I think, is why there's this decrease in participation from women. Something that the Wikimedia Foundation, in the context of Wikipedia, has been knocking themselves out trying to solve. So one possibility is that some of these factors which seem to be motivating have gendered impacts. So in particular, there's a number of authors who have hypothesized that men and women get the same amount of negative feedback, but they process it differently and they react differently. So that's something potentially you could even test with this data set, whether the way, or maybe not with this data set, but certainly looking at the extent to which negative feedback is a motivator to do better versus a discouragement, and whether there are gender impacts in that. That might be one way of getting at this, or just trying to understand at which stage in the process do women self-select out or are selected out. Is it the case that fewer women actually try editing? Is it that the same number of men and women try editing, but fewer men decide to continue as sustained contributors? And to the extent that some of these social movement characteristics are important, just understanding how people actually start to identify with the group. So the sort of small groups that Dov was talking about that really do have a group identity that people feel committed to. So how did that happen exactly? How did people come to feel like they were part of that group of editors? So with that, I will conclude. There's a few more minutes, though, for other questions or general discussion.